Good afternoon. This is Teresa Moulton, Editor-in-Chief of the Change Management Review. I'm excited to have here Melanie Franklin of Agile Change Management in the UK, joining us to speak about change management in 2019. I'll give you a little bit about Melanie. Melanie provides C-suite advisory services specializing in cultural change with specific emphasis on building the internal capability of organizations to plan and lead change initiatives. This work begins with strategic planning of the cultural shift required and practical identification of the staff engagement, training, and support needed to make this a reality. These cultural shifts have many descriptions, including creating agility and digital transformation. However, what they all have in common is an ability for staff to feel that change is part of their role and that they have the motivation to lead change in their sphere of influence. Melanie has delivered these assignments across the private, public, and third sectors. Her clients include, in the public sector, the House of Commons, House of Lords, the Welsh Government, Department for Education, local authorities across the UK, and the European Medicines Agency. In the private sector, she's worked with the Saudi Electricity Company, National Grid US, Zain Telecommunications, and FIFA. And in the third sector / NGO, she's worked with UNOPS, British Red Cross, and the Stroke Association. She is the co-chair of the Change Management Institute in the UK and is a respected author of textbooks and articles on change, project and program management. Melanie is also an examiner responsible for assurance of the work of a team of examiners creating professional qualifications in change management. Melanie is highly respected in her field and is sought out by many organizations all over the world who need support in creating their strategy and plans for managing change. Melanie is a talented communicator and has a reputation for delivering complex information with humor and passion. She draws on her wealth of practical experience to illustrate concepts and to engage her audience in lively debates on advantages and disadvantages of each approach that she outlines. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Melanie.
Thank you very much. Well, you said I'm a talented communicator. I think I'm going to have to prove that now. Now, what I want to do is find out a bit about the audience. So Teresa's going to run a poll just asking you what your job role is, just so that I can get a feel for who you are and then I can angle my comments hopefully more appropriately.
So we've got hovering around 77% change managers, 16% program project managers, 6% business analysts, 2% PMO. And that's where we're remaining right now, and 81% of folks have voted.
Okay, that's lovely. Well, that gives me a bit of a flavour then. Predominantly we're talking about change managers, but I'd like to welcome our less represented groups of PMO, welcome, because I think you're very essential, and we're going to talk about that in a while, to business analysts, who are the glue that holds it all together, and our project and programme management colleagues, so welcome. What I'm going to talk about now is key trends, and I think a lot of that is going to be about volume. I think there's also going to be about the increased awareness for the need of change management, how we map the impact of change, the sponsorship issue, and the ongoing issue about building an organisation's internal capacity for leading change so that it's not relying on others to do change to it, but staff get to do change to themselves. So I'm going to try and cover all of this in about the next 45 minutes. I've had some questions raised already online, and I would encourage you to raise as many questions as possible. And what I'm going to ask Teresa to do, if you could mute yourself now, Teresa, and then what I'll get you to do is perhaps read out the questions to me later when we get towards the end. But first of all, I think let's talk about the fact that the volume of change continues to grow. Let's look at the factors and let's look at the impact of that. In fact, I've been in workshop all day where this has been probably the biggest issue and the thing that we spent the most time on. Let's cut to the simple explanation around the volume of change, but certainly a big driving factor in many organisations, which is that we're moving from this waterfall approach where gathering all the requirements, running the project through from beginning to end, and then going live. And of course, it's when we go live with something and we say it's completely finished, now can you start using it, that we trigger the need for change and the adoption of new ways of working. But in an agile world, what we're saying is we're being far more incremental. We might work in sprints of only 2 or 3 weeks of duration, and hopefully we're creating some valuable change off the back of each of those sprints. Sometimes we will work for several sprints, grouped together in what we call an increment in Agile, and then we'll go live with some change. But whichever approach, we can guarantee that Agile will generate more change. The point is that, of course, every time we generate that change, those in the business have got to get up to speed with it. And therefore, the sheer volume, even if we say that some of the changes coming out of Agile, because they're being drip-fed, are smaller in impact, but actually the brain is still the same. It's still being told, hey, stop doing that and start doing this. And it's still hard to catch up. So I do think that this Agile world, although it's drip-feeding change is incremental, it's actually leading us down a path where change is continuous. I had questions today which were very much by people who were overwhelmed by the volume of change in their organisation and saying, when do we ever get to a point where we can take a breath and just bed down what it is we're changing at the moment? And I'm sorry to say that I think my honest answer is I just don't think we're getting any of the bedding down time at all now. And I think that is one of the reasons I do these webinars, because actually change management skills are becoming an essential survival mechanism for anyone in an organisation, whatever their role, because we've just got to keep pace with the volume of change that's coming at us. So Agile is triggering a lot of change, but also I think many organisations really are in a fight for survival. There are industries that are being heavily disrupted. The retail industry that's being so affected by our urge for online shopping and how that's changing, our high streets and our shopping malls as more and more people don't go to them. So organisations in the retail world are scrabbling around to look for the right things to do to protect their business and grow their business. So they've got lots of change. We have regulators who worry about the new world and keep coming out with new regulations in whichever industry you're in. We're affected by technological change. There's so many new ideas and new adaptations coming out that we're actually sort of struggling to keep up. And of course, with the advent of social media, what organisations find now is that customers have a very direct voice into them, and therefore customers can suggest things that they'd like to see. And there's even more of those, the volume of that, and responding to that and taking on board those ideas. So I think across every industry, across every country that I work in, the one thing that's common is that there is very much change overload. And what organisations are looking for is, oh, heavens, how are we going to cope with this? I think we probably ought to get better at managing change, tends to be the general view. I'm certainly seeing that increased awareness, and I wanted to sort of talk on different angles of this. I apologise in advance for only using UK data, but I wanted to talk about data that I was certain of. But I do think that when I talk about the UK market, I'm very aware that I feel we're in the middle. My colleagues perhaps in Australia and New Zealand are certainly in their culture, change management I think is slightly ahead of the curve. It's more embedded and it's seen as more normal and better understood. I think my colleagues in the US are slightly a step behind in that that's something that organisations are starting to come to an awareness with, but it's not quite as well defined. So I think that sort of from UK is sort of in the middle here, but I think therefore these stats give us some indications of perhaps where things might be going. Change continues to grow because I think that, I use a regularly look at the data on a job board that is an aggregator job board across the whole of the UK market. And what I think is fascinating, because I do this every few months, is that, you look over the last 3 years, really, roles have trebled. Change roles, change managers, for example, that tends to be, in our marketplace, about sort of individual change, looking after specific changes. business transformation roles, the transformation roles tend to equate much more to a program management role, if you like, because what you're looking for is a transformation that's based on a number of integrated changes that you need to lead. So you probably get paid more for a transformation role than a change role. But certainly the numbers are equivalent, that change management roles are becoming more of the norm, and I've got a question for you on that in a moment. So certainly we're seeing in the recruitment market the demand for change management, and certainly over the last few years we've seen recruitment agents who are setting up a change management practice, whereas 20 years ago I remember when so many of them started up a project management practice. So it's certainly becoming more of the norm in terms of an expected job. I work closely with the APMG International, who have a change management practitioner qualification, which I absolutely love because I think it's a brilliant foundational level of skills and techniques and theories and models. But the thing that interests me here is just watching their numbers continue to grow, that more people want to become qualified. And that's a mixture of talking to those over 70% of you who are change managers on this call, that the desire to evidence your experience of change and actually get yourself properly qualified in the thing that you're able to do is obviously a driving force. And there are other people who are coming into this going, I want to learn the basics. It would be nice to get qualified as I do it. But in both sets, people are really sort of, you see the increase in the people, and it's not slowing down, it's increasing year on year. Finally, I think that organisations are now starting to think, well, actually, we probably ought to have a recognised function for change management, and that they're doing this in a variety of different ways. I don't see any evidence of there being one particular sort of way of doing things. I think many organisations start with the natural pattern is to set up some kind of centralised change management team, change management function, where that reports into, it's either into the Chief Operating Officer, sometimes into the Chief Financial Officer, but certainly it might even be aligned into project and programme management, as I sometimes it sits within IT, but they tend to start with that. And once that's been established as some kind of centre of excellence, being responsible for perhaps what's the method for managing change, just like we have the method owners for project management. And then perhaps starting to develop, well, who's going to do change management? And I've put up a couple of examples here, which are pretty common, I think, and organisations sort of argue between this all the time, is that should there be a change manager assigned to individual projects? And if that's the case, you know, the project manager oversee what they do. If that is the case, then it puts quite a lot of pressure on project managers to have a pretty good understanding of all of the activities around behavioural change. One of my correspondents did request that I address a comment I'd made in a paper, which was about being more explicit about what we do in change management. And I'm going to talk about that in a little while. But certainly project managers, if they've got change managers working for their projects, really ought to get a good understanding of what's involved. Sometimes we have change managers who are actually assigned to a whole group of projects, and what, you know, the interface between the project, the change manager is with the subject matter experts in the business, and that makes sense if there's an awful lot of change that's all hitting the same business area, that you've got somebody who is sort of helping them get prepared for that level of change. But either way, the role of the change manager, I think, is becoming ever more important. Now, I was asking Teresa if she'd run a quick poll to see how many of you have got sort of formal change management within your organisation. So, Teresa, if you could run that, that would be great.
We've got 56 yes, 44 no.
Yes and no to which question? I didn't hear that.
How many of you work in organizations where there is a formal role called change manager assigned to each project?
Ooh, so it's half and half, really. Okay.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, that's lovely. Thank you very much. So I think it shows you that, you know, increasingly we're seeing organisations who are putting that role on, but there's still a long way to go. And to be fair, you know, I'm not going to ask you this on a poll question, so don't worry. But how many of you really think in your organisations that even if the 56% who do have change managers as formal roles, how many executives really understand what that role is all about, and how many other people within the business really understand what that role is all about? So I still think we've got a long way to go. But it certainly, it is showing that change management is being taken more seriously. I do think in the last couple of years we've taken a leap forward on that one. And finally, I think that we're starting to see people recognise that perhaps change management isn't just something soft and fluffy, and that perhaps it has some value. And I think aligning ourselves to the world of benefits management, which is still a very hot topic, and saying, actually, change management is a risk management activity. It manages the risk, number one, that you won't achieve the benefits from your project investment. At the top of this diagram, you can see that we've got a project investment in here, and if we're not properly managing change, what tends to happen is that, yeah, some people pick up and run with and use the stuff that the project has delivered. For example, so many of my clients are putting Salesforce.com in place. But if that isn't properly managed, and all the behavioural changes and all the new ways of working that we want the sales team, relationship managers, sales support staff to undertake, if that isn't really guided, then yeah, we'll get some of the benefits that we're hoping for from this big platform, but not as many as we could have done. You look at the bottom diagram and you realise that, yeah, if we manage it, what we'll get is we'll get the benefits in earlier in the life cycle, and also we'll probably get even more benefits because people feel so much more confident in how they're expected to behave. So I think this is just an illustrative diagram, but I think it's seeing change management very much as managing the risk of not getting the return on investment. But I think also there's another risk that change management is now starting to be seen as quite important about, and this comes back to the volume of change, which is that change management is addressing the risk of overload and imbalance. If an organisation has got so much change on that we're taking people back time and time again out of the business to manage change, we're destabilising the capability for business as usual. Now that's when we start to offer very bad service to our clients, that's when our customers start to disappear, that's when we are perhaps just not able to do the day-to-day delivery of what customers already know us for. Now we might have so many new ideas and so many exciting products and services we want to launch, but if so many staff are caught up in that, and then we're not balancing the business as usual with the change management, then we've got a big problem. And I think increasingly, certainly in the boardrooms that I talk to, that is something that captures their imagination. Oh, you're the person that handles that level of risk. Oh, okay. And I do think it's important that as change managers, we start to position ourselves as a risk management strategy, because for those who see change management sort of soft and fluffy and a nice thing to have, well, that's great. They're on board already. But so for people who are perhaps in the risk management end of our business, if they can start to see, because we start to talk in their language, that we have some value to add, then that just widens the audience for people who respect our profession. And I'm very much about growing the pie, because we all benefit. The more people in an organisation that understand what it is I'm there to do, the more people I've got who are willing to work with me. And after all, change management is about getting to a tipping point where more people are working in the new way than not. And so that's quite important for me, that I'm by talking about change as risk management, I'm opening myself up to a whole new audience, and a very important audience.
Melanie, this is Teresa. I just wanted to intervene here. There's some clicking in the background. If everyone could make sure that they're muted so that we can continue with the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is, if I've made the case, I think, for the fact that change management is one of the key trends we're seeing, is change management is being taken more seriously. Let's have a look at some of the key trends about what organisations are looking for. I think what you're going to find when I talk in this section is that I think overall, practical help is what organisations are really looking for in terms of change management now. And I'm going to give some examples of the things that organisations are most looking for. I think number one is going back to this issue of we're really worried about overload. So if we're really worried about overload, how do we map the totality of impact of all of the changes that are taking place in our organisation? How do we track that we're not going to destabilise the business? And I think if you start with that as your sort of problem that you're trying to solve, I think organisations are solving it in a variety of different ways, starting with the most common, which is starting to really understand the value of good portfolio management. Sometimes I can't win this argument at the board level, but what I find, so I don't always need a total organisation-wide portfolio to be created. Sometimes just winning it at each individual business unit level is sufficient enough. Because my point is, before you get started on change, you need to understand what's actually happening. Where are you? And portfolio management gives you the wider context. And I think that's important for not destabilising the business, but I think it's also important as a sanity protector for staff, who you can use the portfolio to create a really comprehensive picture of change. In fact, I'm looking at this diagram now feeling really guilty because I redeveloped it today, and I need to add this to the next slide, which is, you can see that I've got red, yellow and green there. Well, I actually did something on the left-hand side, which is after in progress, which is those changes that have landed and people are now sort of practicing and adopting. So the reason I added that is that I think at any one time, when I'm trying to explain a change that I'm trying to help a business unit make, I need to put it into the context of everything else that they're experiencing, because then that's empathy. Then it's empathetic that I'm walking in their shoes, because I'm not being naive. I'm not trying to put across an individual change when that's not their experience. Their experience is they've got multiple changes and they're not really sure, you know, how it all fits together. So that's the plan, right? So when I'm talking to them about all of these different changes, I need to be able to say, right, these are the things that are already underway. These are the things that are coming up. And these are some of the ideas on the horizon that you might be hit by. And what I was doing today was extending that and saying, actually, these are the things that you've recently adopted. These are the things that are underway. These are the things that are planned. And these are the things that are coming up. But I think that if you can get your portfolio organised and you can actually map all the things that are out there, then that's an incredibly important part of it. Now, the next thing I want to do is put up the idea of horizon scanning, because I think if you're going to do portfolio management well, to give you that contextual picture, that holistic picture of all the changes, you do need some kind of rigorous process for horizon scanning, looking out for what the potential ideas are in the future. Horizon scanning, rigorous process, but also regular process. How are you tracking, you know, what your future of work looks like? And that doesn't need to be looking that far in the future. I think if we look too far in the future, we are in fantasy land anyway. But we do need to have a process that says, well, what sort of indicators are we getting in the market, from the media, from our regulators? What are we seeing our competitors doing that might indicate there are things coming up? You know, let's look at related industries and what changes they're making, upstream and downstream in our supply chain, that might have an effect on us in the future. They're not affecting us yet, but that might be out there. Because I think the more we can talk to the business about this, what might be coming, the less they're surprised and the more help we're providing. So I think first is establish the portfolio and then support it with this rigorous approach for horizon scanning. I think it's incredibly helpful, incredibly important. And then I think the other thing that's quite important in terms of change management is that it's supported by this idea of prioritization. Now, what I'm showing here is the Moscow prioritization. Just to keep it simple, must have, should have, could have, and won't have this time. I think understanding which ones are moving, if I just go back for a moment, from idea into planned, you know, what are the ones that have the greatest value, that are, their time has come, that they are an enabler for something else. Those are all the factors I'd look for a must-have item. And I think if you're going to run portfolio management well, if you've got all of your potential changes mapped out there, the question to ask is, okay, which one do we start working on next? And therefore, which is the most valuable to us at this point in time? What becomes a must-have? We've all got hundreds of should-haves, things we'd really like to get moving on. But the thing that we're looking for with good portfolio management is a willingness to apply the rigour of prioritisation. The other thing that I think is very important is when people are looking at their prioritisation, if they're doing portfolio management, if for change managers, we should get something else into the argument, and I put it in red there, that something should only be regarded as a must-have if not only is the idea good, but at the same time there is a genuine commitment somewhere in the business for its implementation to be resourced. Otherwise, all that we're doing is adding to the plate spinning that's going on, and that destabilises the business as usual, because staff become overwhelmed by the level of change. They never actually get anything achieved. They're being caught up in loads of meetings for lots of different things. So I think there's something we can do as change professionals, which is to get people to start really asking, have we got the time? Have we got the people? Have we got the skills available to actually implement this and get this adopted as a new way of working? Not just that we're going to run a project where perhaps we procure a new system or we develop a new process, but nobody's got the time to actually change how they work. So I think that extra red line is quite important. So portfolio management is, I think, a fundamental, and I think the most important thing about the trends is how that is now being recognised. I've been doing some informal surveys, and this time last year, when I put up a question which said, how many of you have got portfolio management, it was around about 30%. This time this year, I've been getting sort of answers around 70 to 80%. These are all UK audiences. So what I've seen happen is that we're getting the hang of portfolio management. The next thing that I want to talk about is something that organisations are now saying, now we realise that we ought to get a hang of this bit. But the trend is that they haven't yet, but they're showing some interest in it. And what they're showing interest in is the idea of actually using that portfolio to provide the left-hand side of this diagram, which is the index of every single initiative that's on the go, so that they can map when it's going to affect certain teams, certain departments, certain business units, and actually start to get an idea from a heat map of when particular business units might be overwhelmed. So we're getting, I think, I see the trend now of people are actually starting to use some of this idea to go, do you know what? We don't just need to know what change we've got going on, but we need to use that information to proactively try to identify when problems might be hitting us. And if we've got team one's got several projects going live, all hitting at the same time, then possibly what we need to do is spread things out a little bit. Maybe we need to lighten the load. Some organisations, when they are doing this heat mapping, I think where they get clever is they don't have any problem at all putting something on hold, because there's no point heat mapping if you haven't got the decisive capability to back it up. But I think the heat map is an indicator that we're moving on, we are evolving, and now we're sort of using change management as that risk management strategy to go, let's not overload the business, because the business is where we make our money. Today's business is what funds the changes we want to make for tomorrow. And once people get that cycle, then that's probably why they're interested in this. Now, I've just said that this really works if you've got people to take decisive action. And I think the next thing I want to talk about is an absolutely very strong trend is the need for effective sponsorship and that overarching view that, yeah, we've got to get the hang of this. I'm starting to see, certainly as a trend, the demand for sponsorship training is going through the roof. Organisations realising that it's not good enough just to train sort of those in the business and those within project management about what change management is, but actually those that sponsor the initiative. And I think the perhaps the key thing is that there is starting to be, I don't think we're there yet, this is not the norm, but some of my clever clients have worked out that perhaps what they've got is sponsors who are sponsoring the project life cycle, i.e. they're sponsoring delivery, and therefore they're asking lots of questions about what's being delivered, when's it being delivered, are we on budget? When actually the real issue is that they need to be sponsoring the project life cycle, and the change life cycle. So the full range is actually the sponsorship life cycle. And once they've had that illuminating idea, there's the realization that our sponsors don't really understand what change management's all about. If they do understand it, then they ask different questions. Now, this goes to my correspondent who asked about my comment where I'd said in one of my papers that I think we as change professionals now need to get far more explicit about what we do, because I do think that people just don't get it. They either just don't understand what we do at all, or they have an interpretation of it as sort of soft and fluffy. Oh, we just do comms, don't we? We just tell people about change. I think we have to go back to our own definitions of what change is all about. The one that I use and keep in the forefront of my mind is that I have a series of persuasive conversations, and I put on events that enable those impacted by the change to be increasingly exposed to the change, to understand it more and more, and then to become more and more involved in it. So I lead them through that life cycle of initial awareness, then getting them involved in actually trying it out, having a go, practicing the new ways of working, and then finally giving them sufficient time and encouragement to keep it practicing so that they become adopting it. It becomes the new way of working. It becomes the new norm for them. So my job is those persuasive, motivating, inspiring, influencing conversations and communications, and that includes the events, the opportunities for then getting involved in change. And I think that's not a difficult definition, but it's certainly something that when I talk to board members is a compelling proposition, because they understand that my job is to inspire people to behave in a different way, but that success can only come if an individual decides to behave in a different way. It is not something that we can impose. You know, we can set all the rules we like, but people will only sort of comply with them, but they won't really embed the change unless we support them and encourage them. And I think it's incredibly important to win the argument with sponsors and potential sponsors about what their real role is. My experience of sponsor training is that actually when they have that moment of discovery and they get it, they go, wow, because they realise that actually perhaps they haven't been asking all the questions they should have been asking. They've been asking project managers how the project's going, but they haven't been paying enough attention within the business to say, what's our level of business preparedness? Or even before that, what's our level of business impact? You know, how is it going to affect business as usual if we go live with this? And are we ready to go live with this? You know, and I've had some fantastic sponsorship events where you get to see people make that connection and go, oh wow, I'm going to change how I do things. I think an indicator that perhaps we're winning that activity, we're winning that war, is when PMOs are being asked by sponsors to come up with new metrics and to measure different things about the progress of project initiatives. I don't see enough evidence of that. I know a few chief executives where this message has landed, and that's exactly what they're doing. But if we step back for a moment and recognise that the PMO is about decision support, investment support for senior leaders, then surely if we widen out the portfolio to recognise the question, have we got the resources to implement this as part of our prioritisation criteria? If we win the argument that sponsors are sponsoring both delivery and behavioural change, and therefore they need to ask impact questions and preparedness questions, readiness questions, then eventually it is going to filter down to the PMO to go, we need to be putting different measures in. And what excites me about so many organisations that have got great platforms for managing their PPM work is that I think those platforms give us a golden opportunity to easily embed those questions in there and track those questions and track change management activities. So hopefully with those new metrics, that's going to filter down to the PMO. So the PMO is going to provide support on how organisations and sponsors particularly are taking account of behavioural change. I think as we come towards the end of my presentation piece and move towards your questions, I think something else that we look at when it comes to sponsorship my system's not even allowing me to change slides now, is I wanted to talk about the fact that perhaps that simple life cycle gives us an indication of what some of these measures might be. Awareness, participation and adoption as a simple life cycle. And also maybe one of the things we ought to be tracking as standard underpinning that is perception, how people feel about the change. Because unless they're feeling positive, they're not going to participate in it. Unless they're feeling positive after participation, they're not going to adopt it. So I think there are some simple groups of measures that perhaps we ought to move towards. And increasingly, I'm seeing this as a trend that people really want to talk about. What should we be tracking? Yeah. So I think that we have shifted on this now, and organisations are now starting to work out what measures they want to be tracking to understand the success of the overall change that they're launching. As part of clarifying the role of the sponsor, I'm starting to see a willingness to have conversations perhaps between the sponsor and the change manager in trying to understand what should be escalated, what shouldn't be escalated, how the sponsor can best help the change manager resolve blockages and perhaps champion the change, but also how the change manager can help the sponsor by providing information. I don't think we're there yet, but I'm starting to see this as something that perhaps is becoming more of the norm, that actually there's a willingness to work out how this relationship's going to work. Possibly because the change role is not as well understood as it could be yet, but it will be good to see this further develop. And I think finally, there is now a real understanding that change management being an essential skill set, change management is something that we'll need capability in, but we also need capacity for. And I think what I've put up here is a simple diagram of something I've been working on with lots of clients about, well, how do you create the culture that says change management is an essential skill set, change management is something we should support. And this, of course, is a simple model of any cultural change that's there in front of you. So I think you have to start with the vision of what good would look like. Earlier this week I was working with a group who were really stumbling over this, but the point is that saying, well, if you were able to manage lots of changes, if you were able to do that using your own staff and not having to bring lots of people in all the time, what exactly would that look like? How would that work? What kind of reporting lines would there be? What kind of roles would you be hiring? What kind of competencies would you be looking for? So setting up that vision and perhaps some core beliefs behind that about what's really important to the organisation. Some examples would be where organisations who are committing to building the capability for change are saying things like, we want everybody to realise that change is everybody's responsibility, not just senior leaders' responsibility. We want everyone to realise that it's okay to try things out around here, and that when you first try things out, we recognise that you make mistakes. The only thing we want you to do is try to rework those. But we know that change is linked to experimenting. So that might be some of the core beliefs that your organisation needs to adopt if change management is going to become sort of a prioritised business function. If you want change management capability to be respected, then you have to think about the fact that, well, actually, one of the things we need to put sort of processes in place to actually make that happen. Those processes are things that we're sort of the norm, if you like. This is how we do things, and those processes that I've seen organisations do is they've changed their competency model for how they're hiring staff. So they're increasingly seeing questions around, you know, being able to adapt to a fast-moving environment where there are multiple changes all of the time. They're also updating job descriptions to reflect the fact that all members of staff have a responsibility for not only doing their day job, but trying to identify improvements to how things might run better. If you're going to change any kind of job description or any kind of hiring processes, then probably you will have to look at your own rewards package. Even if that's not financial rewards, but it's actually, what do we celebrate around here? What do we thank people for? What do we acknowledge as far as their achievements are concerned? So I don't think rewards always has to be the financial rewards. It has to be culturally, it has to be, well, what do we take notice of and thank people for? I think if we're going to do any kind of cultural change, that has to be backed up with role modelling. I don't think role modelling always has to be a senior leader. I think it has to be those that others follow most naturally. And so looking at maybe supervisors, junior line managers, middle management, and sort of seeing how they are balancing the day job with some change responsibilities, how they are helping to lead change, can be very impactful for others to go, if they're doing it, maybe I can follow. And of course, what tends to happen with role modelling is that when people see something working, they tend to tell stories about it. So, and we tend to embellish for a dramatic premise. So, you know, when you see somebody sort of getting involved in a change, I can't name the organisation, but this is a story that's being told right across their organisation, that the CEO has come out of her office and she's now regularly attending various team meetings for teams that are doing quite a lot of transformation within her organisation. And what she's saying is, hey, I'm here to learn from you, to listen to you, and I'm here to resolve any problems that you think my level of hierarchy can help with. And just by saying those things, she becomes part of that team and part of that problem solving for while she's there in the meeting. And of course, because she's the CEO, that kind of role modelling of how leaders are supposed to help make change happen is being talked about right across the organisation. And I think it's amazing. You know, it's really got people talking about it, which is, of course, building that culture for change is something really good. You know, even the CEOs getting on board with change management. So I think we have a responsibility. If we're interested in building up the capability for change in our organisations, perhaps we need to be thinking about some of these things and thinking, how can we normalise it? How can we put sort of change management activities into all of our plans? How can we put change management responsibilities in people's job descriptions? How can we put it into their performance measures? How can we put ability to manage change into interview questions? You know, so just thinking about those sorts of things, I think, is something that increasingly we're going to see. I did not see some of this stuff a couple of years ago, but over the last 2 years, really starting to see this come to fruition. I hope this gives you a bit of a flavour for what some of the things that I think are coming up in change. But if I have to summarise, what I think is happening is that there are lots of organisations now that have done some of the hard graft. They've done quite a lot of training in change management. They've appointed a sort of central function of change managers who go out and help with the really big changes. And where they're now trying to get interested is in getting some practical help and democratising change by helping managers in the business to be able to lead the new ways of working, the creation of new ways of working for themselves. So they're looking for simple change plans, understanding what's involved in change management activities and really giving practical help to the business. And alongside that, recognising that that has to be partnered with real governance of change, and that means a real understanding of the sponsor role and giving encouragement to people to sponsor the whole life cycle of both delivery and the implementation. So I'm excited about my profession because I see that it is continuing to develop. We are quite a young profession. I think when I started 30 years ago, everything was about project management, and change management just wasn't a phrase that was used. You know, speed that, the last 10 years ago, it was something that we started to talk about in quite serious terms. And now it's an industry, it's a profession. And we are getting better at it with every year that passes. We're learning from each other and we are developing. So I think all of these trends point to something which is saying we're going to get good at this, and this is an important management discipline that should be respected. I hope you feel the same way, and I'm now getting ready to answer all of your questions. So hopefully, Teresa, you've had a few questions sent in as I was talking.
Yes, quite a few. Let's see here. Okay, getting past the clicking. Okay, so this one is Just a comment. In Silicon Valley, while I am seeing more change managers assigned to projects, most of them are junior in experience and not empowered to actually affect outcomes. In general, management is assigning these roles in order to say they are doing change management, but they are not prepared to change project plans based on recommendations from change management experts. So that's just a comment that was made. Have you seen anything, Melanie, in terms of people entering the field, getting their certifications, and then how they're able to perform going right into the job?
Well, I think that's what you've just read out is sort of change management in name only, really, isn't it? Because I think that's a very sad story because it's setting up junior staff to fail, really, because they haven't got the empowerment to help create new ways of working. I actually have a story like that myself from the Middle East for an organisation that doesn't really know what change management is all about. And my answer to that is that indicates to me that we need to get back into the real decision makers and probably the way that we'll get their respect and for them to start seeing the value of change management is to talk about change management as a risk management strategy. The risk of not getting the return on investment from an individual project and the risk of managing the risk of change overload within the business. And I think that anyone who's working in that kind of situation, that's the messaging that you've got to escalate up through your organisation if you want people to take change management seriously and therefore give some empowerment to those staff that are working in it. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Here's another one. Have you seen organizational change management level being recognized as a standalone discipline which requires a governance structure that can be justified as a practice group outside of PMO structure within organizations? Or do you see OCM functioning best within a PMO on a project base only instead of transformation, i.e. culture change?
I'm actually seeing a lot of organisations who are splitting it out from project management, even though perhaps the way they started their change management functions was within project management. They're now starting to see that perhaps with the volume of change and the fact that perhaps some of the activities, as I outlined with portfolio management, are really quite strategic activities. And so increasingly I'm seeing change management as becoming a separate management function. It's in addition to project and program management, and I think that causes program managers some difficulties, but it's an additional sort of function. It's an additional set of resources that people can call upon. But I am increasingly seeing that separation if organizations set up change management within project management. And for those organizations that are coming to the party a little bit later and just setting up their change management, I'm increasingly seeing the question, where should we have this reporting into? And the immediate answer isn't project management. It is operational management, or it might be the strategy team, the strategy function that sits off the board or the chief executive, but not automatically being in project and program management, because there's a recognition, I think, that too often project management sits within IT, and a recognition that not all change is IT-based change these days. And so it wouldn't be helpful to have it sitting in there. So I think that's helping organisations saying, no, we need to put it somewhere else and we need to separate it out. So increasingly, separating out, I think, is a trend.
Great. Let's see. How easy is it for a portfolio level PMO to move to a change management role?
I think it's really easy because I think you don't need to change anything other than the questions that you ask in terms of tracking progress of initiatives. I think you have all of the structure and all of the capabilities to be able to do this. I just think the questions are different. Instead of asking if all the activities have been completed, if they've been completed on time and on budget, if everything has been tested and passed its tests, I think you add just a whole range of questions around stakeholder identification, level of engagement of staff who are going to be affected by change, the impact assessment questions. Has the business unit that's going to be affected by the project started to identify how it's going to be impacted? How ready is it? What steps has it taken to create new ways of working, to communicate with customers, communicate with suppliers? Generally, what's the overall level of readiness within that business unit? That will be based on perception as well as the activities they've taken. So I think PMOs are our best friend if they start asking all of those questions, because they are providing really important data for sponsors, but they also act in a way as an assurance function on those of us who are working in change. They're holding us to account just as they hold project managers to account. And I welcome that, because I think that means we're being taken seriously.
Great. We have another question. What do you think is the value of having all change resources in the PMO trained on the same methodology to have a consistent approach versus checking the box of having a person on the project?
I'm never that worried about everybody being trained in exactly the same way, or having, even I'm always a little bit skeptical about having one single methodology, because the problem with change is that the type of change, the culture of the business unit affected, the level of resistance based on the past experience of those people with change, what that change is going to be doing to their roles, is all very different. I think what's really important is that when we bring together change management professionals, whatever training they've had, whatever approaches they've got, that they should design a change management approach that works for their organisation and the kinds of changes that they are doing. Keep the life cycle simple so that it's easy to explain to others. Use wording that isn't sort of technical jargon. Like, this is why I'm always talking about awareness, participation and adoption. You know, it could be awareness, participation and implementation. Use words that make sense to others within the business, but agree amongst yourselves, look, this is a simple steps we take people through, and start telling everybody this is how we manage change. These are the things that we do. Because I think the more people who understand what we do, the easier it is for us to work with. But find your own method, find your own approach, and be very open to lots and lots of new techniques, because I do want to be clear, we are a very young profession. And the reason methodology makes me uncomfortable is it makes me feel that we're closing out the possibility of new ideas coming. And I think we are changing as much as we're trying to make change happen. And I think we have to be open to this. I feel I am learning every single month. I'm learning a new technique, a new idea, a new concept, a new way of putting something across that's more impactful, more powerful. So that whole idea of a methodology scares me a little bit, but an agreement on the general approach, a life cycle sort of few steps, and a whole range of techniques that you keep adding to so that your toolkit grows all of the time, that I think is really important.
Good. And here's a question. How do you typically layer in the dimension of time? I think this is relative to the heat map slide. How do you typically layer in the dimension of time, because projects may be hitting teams at different time intervals?
I think that I was going to try and move back to it, but it won't let me move to the slide. I think that you should look on a time basis, so whether or not it's monthly or whether it's quarterly, and I think you should be asking what's going to go live on any given month. I actually prefer my heat map, I tend to lay out as a full 12 months. So I start to look at which months we're going to hit people with, because when we first hit them with change, we know that there's a long tail end, don't we? We know that there's that transition curve as people start to experience the change. They go through the learning dip, they come up the other side as they continue to build their competence in it. So whichever month we go, if we go live in month 3, I still think we've got the tail end of that change showing all the way through probably until month 12. And I think that's quite important, because then you can start to see that although we went live in 1 month, please don't think it's all going to be done and dusted in that month. So we can show the long tail, if you like, of every. So that's why my heat maps, under each team, I've got a full 12 months showing, and I sort of trail that sort of the initial impact all the way through to the end of when I think it's going to happen, so that they can see that perhaps a team is being affected by a change that went live 2 months ago, a change that went live a month ago, a change that's going live this month, and a change that's due to happen next month. And we're getting to a point now whereas next month they will have 4 changes that they are at varying levels of competence with. How many more can we add on to them before they fall over? That, I think, is the question.
Yeah, if we can answer that, that would be really good.
Probably the answer was that you get to 3 and you fall over, because I think as a human brain, there's only so many things I think I can handle at any one time, and that's the big conversation at the moment. That heat mapping conversation is really hot right now about how we're coping, because we are overloading people, and people are starting to scream, "Stop! Let me think."
Right. And here's a follow-on question. How long does it typically take to create a heat map from the change perspective using an Agile approach?
The Agile approach means that there's so much more change, so much more frequently, but I think the general view remains the same, which is that spread it out over the weeks and months. But the point is, where are you getting your information from about when changes are going to go live? And how many people are contributing to that? So a heat map, I think, is a very collaborative exercise. I think it would be great if we could get the PMO involved, because I think they could provide a really valuable service in doing this, because they have exposure, I think, to a wide range of initiatives. So the PMO, if they're overseeing the portfolio, there's clearly a link in there. But making sure that perhaps we do go, if you've got a very agile house, your heat map needs to go down to the sprint level. What are the drip-feeded changes going to be? I think that's the thing. You have to go down to the level at which people are actually experiencing change. And in an agile place, that's going to probably be every sprint.
Yeah, that's going to be quite a spreadsheet, isn't it?
I think, yeah, spreadsheet's one thing. I think asking yourself the question, how can I turn this into something visual? I know lots of organisations are using Kanban boards now.
Uh-huh.
And I think that is quite an important technique. I think, how can you make this accessible to people? Because I'll tell you what, if you show me a spreadsheet, I tend to turn off almost immediately. But if you show me a fluttering wall of, I've got some big cards with every month of the year written on it, and if you show me a fluttering wall of post-it notes underneath each of those months, I immediately get whether we're overloaded or not. So I think one of the things we increasingly have to do is to help people see what's going on and not bury the information in perhaps formats that they're going to find very hard to get to grips with.
That's a great point. And we have about 2 minutes left, and I think we could fit in one more question. What do you see as the most important competencies and skills to being an effective change manager?
I was only talking about this today. I suppose the obvious answer would be empathy, because you have to walk in the shoes of those who are being asked to work in new ways. And I think if you're empathetic, you can appreciate why people resist change, because of course what you're saying to them is, sorry, what you're doing at the moment's not good enough. Now you need to do something completely different. And we understand how threatening that message is. But I will add, I think, because of the volume of change issue, 2 things. One, emotional resilience. I think that is becoming one of the key things. Is with so much change going on, we get so many knockbacks, we get so many people who are really struggling and are resisting change. Can we pick ourselves off the floor when perhaps we've been heavily criticised, or we've been at the sharp end of somebody's emotional reaction to change? And it does take it out of you. And have you got coping mechanisms for being able to do that? Any self-care mechanisms, whether it's some physical exercise or it's taking some quiet time out, but how do you cope when things aren't going well? Make sure you get your own house in order on that one. And at the same time this morning, we also talked about physical stamina, because I think work has become, it's more complicated. People feel like they're standing on shifting sands all the time, and they have to work incredibly hard just to stand still. And so sometimes that physical, just be able to keep going, you know, and maintain your energy levels, there's something in that as well. So resilience, I think, generally.
That makes sense. Really does. Well, Melanie, thank you so much for your wisdom and your insight and your experience and sharing that with us. I think we're out of time right now, but thank you again to the audience for all your interactivity, and we'll definitely be having Melanie back on another variety of topics where she can share her share her pearls of wisdom with us.
You
So
can always
thank you
get me
very
through.
much.
You can always get me through LinkedIn if you want to follow up with things. We'll find ideas, and then I will make sure that I get that material through to Teresa. So thank you.
Okay, everyone, thank you very much. See you soon.